Okay, I'm just going to leave a minute longer for people to join. Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the second Innovation Sandboxes webinar, Getting to Deployment, Bridging the Gaps in Energy Innovation in Canada. My name's Emily. I'm the Communications Advisor with Quest. And today I am going to be going over the Q&A, and your presenters are Richard Carlson from Pollution Probe and Aïda Nciri from Quest. A few housekeeping rules before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website, and all registrants will receive a link to the recording and the slides. We will have time as well at the end of the presentation for Q&A. Please put your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them at the Q&A session. That's all for me. Handing it over to Aïda and Richard.
Thank you very much, Emily. So thank you again for attending this webinar on our last report, Getting to Deployment, Bridging the Gaps in Energy Innovation in Canada. This report is part of Pollution Probe and Quest joint initiative on Innovation Sandboxes. And we hope that by the end of this webinar, you will have a better understanding of what Innovation Sandboxes are, and more importantly, how they fit into the energy context and how they can contribute to meet Canada's zero emission targets. So as mentioned before, my name is Aïda Nciri. I'm the Manager of Policy and Research at Quest. And I will present today webinar with my colleague Richard. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation from Chief Draigis territory, traditional home of the Yellowknives Dini, and these are also the traditional lands of the North Slave Métis. So for those who don't know Quest, we are a national non-government organization that works to accelerate the adoption of smart energy communities by informing, inspiring, and connecting decision makers. Our activities include research, advisory services, and projects, as well as working groups. And you can check more on our ongoing initiatives on our website. Richard, I'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning, I guess. My name is Richard Carlson. I'm the Director of Energy Policy at Pollution Probe, which is Canada's oldest environmental NGO. You can check out our website for more details on energy and other environmental work. And today I'm speaking from Toronto, the land of which has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this island. In case you missed our last call, this report is part of our 4-year Innovation Sandbox project, which is the aim of developing tailored policy frameworks for innovation sandboxes across Canada. On today's webinar, I was not expecting that movement there. On today's webinar, we want to present to you about our new publication, Getting to Deployment. But first, we're going to summarize on what we first learned on Innovation Sandboxes. We'll then talk about our new report, which looks at energy innovation policies across Canada. We'll then look at how Innovation Sandboxes can contribute to innovation in Canada. We will, of course, have a Q&A section at the end, so please do send us questions as we discussed at the top. And there's the Q&A and function at the top of Zoom, and I'm sure all of us have done many of these in the last 12 months, so it should be relatively simple for everybody to go through. First, what are Innovation Sandboxes? And our first report, Enter the Sandbox, came out in July 2020 and was an international evaluation of innovation sandboxes in the energy sector. For this report, we looked at 10 energy innovation sandboxes that either had been implemented or were under development around the world. We think this is a valuable addition to the discussions on innovation sandboxes in North America, and was one of the only international comparisons in English. You can find it on both our websites if you want to know a lot more detail on innovation sandboxes, or I believe our first webinar is also, you can watch our first webinar online as well. So what do we mean when we say innovation sandboxes? Innovation sandboxes can be defined as a toolkit that uses collaboration to create conditions for a safe and controlled space in which new energy products, services, and business models can be tested in a real-world environment. And has the ultimate game of informing lasting systemic change that can enable clean energy innovation that benefits the energy sector, that includes consumers and society. We show in our first report that innovation sandboxes are more than just regulatory trials. Our research showed that innovation sandboxes consist really of three main tools. The first is innovation hubs, which use collaborative tools or platforms to enable knowledge exchange and the sharing of lessons among diverse stakeholders. The second tool are inquiry services, where innovators can informally discuss their project with policymakers and regulators to help them navigate the complex energy landscape and understand if the barriers that they see are real barriers or just perceived barriers. And in many cases, what has been found internationally is that they're just perceived barriers. And the third tool is regulatory trials, which does allow for the time-bound exemptions and derogations from regulation with the proper controls in order to test new ways of doing things. And the last feature of innovation sandboxes is that all the findings from the three services, from innovation hubs, from inquiry services, and from regulatory trials are then used to inform future policy and regulatory changes, which can help the energy sector adapt for the future, and prepare itself for the future. So innovation sandboxes are far more than just regulatory trials. And it is this, we need to all these elements in order to enable change in the energy sector. The first report highlighted that there are multiple benefits of innovation sandboxes. The first is they remove non-technological barriers and look at system integration and deployment. They protect consumers, and they also protect the entire system because they allow for controlled change and mitigating risk. They're flexible and can work with different forms of energy. Well, in the past, we've mostly seen electricity as being the focus of most innovation sandboxes. They generally now, all innovation sandboxes are starting to look at innovation in natural gas and thermal, as well as transportation, particularly with the rise of electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging. And they do have the potential to test new types of fuels as well, such as renewable fuels. And innovation sandboxes also foster collaboration, which helps identify problems and more efficiently frame solutions. There's also a diversity of reasons as to why a jurisdiction would want to introduce an innovation sandbox. The most common reason that we have heard is, of course, business model transformation, the new business models in the energy sector that are coming out, and also increasing competition, especially in those liberalized energy markets. But not all innovation sandboxes are concerned with those. Reducing emissions and allowing faster rollout of low carbon energy sources is becoming a more common reason for developing an innovation sandbox. Sandboxes are also structured differently. And so while most jurisdiction, the sandbox lives with the regulator, the energy regulator. In Austria, for example, the sandbox is going to be housed with a public research body. And that was done deliberately, as it was felt that by housing it at a public research body, it would allow for greater innovation than what would potentially be possible if we're housed at the regulator. In Belgium, the sandbox is actually part of an industry association. And in most cases, the reasons for the sandbox dictates the structure. If regulatory barriers are the sole reason for the sandbox, then it makes sense to house it within the regulator. If, however, reducing emissions is the goal of the sandbox, a different structure may be more appropriate. And from our international research, we discovered that there are 6 primary lessons that we learned. First, a well-designed sandbox needs to prioritize ongoing learning to inform policy, regulatory, and other institutional changes. Second, an effective sandbox should prioritize collaboration, transparency, and knowledge sharing among multiple traditional and non-traditional energy players. And this collaboration needs to include the actual designing of the innovation sandbox itself. Third, effective sandboxes need to be supported by a culture of innovation. And this requires leadership from within the regulator or the government, or preferably both. In many cases, it is a leadership within the institutions from the top offices of the institution that allow for this type of innovation to happen. Fourth, a well-designed sandbox accounts for the fact that the role of the regulator needs to change in the changing energy sector. regulators need to play a larger role in facilitating innovation and in working with new players in at least two ways. First, regulators need to engage new stakeholders, and they need to do that in a different way. Non-traditional players, and a lot of innovators would count as this, do not speak the regulator's language, and they can feel overwhelmed by the regulatory machine, which I'm sure we all know it can be very, very complex. And second, regulators need to provide inquiry service mechanisms to help innovators navigate the regulatory landscape. They can no longer just be the passive actors responding to what people come to them for. The fifth lesson learned is that well-designed sandboxes promote real innovation that benefits and protects consumers. Innovation does not necessarily, of course, have to benefit consumers and society. So the focus on innovations in innovation sandboxes should be on what we refer to as genuine innovation, which benefits everybody. Innovation that benefits all groups in society and is not, and is as opposed to say simply cost shifting or hurting one group more than the other. Successful sandboxes set up the criteria to make sure they accomplish that this genuine innovation, beneficial innovation. And the last lesson is that objectives will dictate the design of the sandbox. So innovation sandboxes need to have clear objectives if they are going to be successful. And I'll now pass on to Aïda to talk about our new report.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the refresher. And so, yeah, let's deep dive into the new reports we released last November. So the report Getting to Deployment reviews current energy innovation programs in Canada and looks at how innovation sandboxes can fit into this current energy programs landscape. So Canada, of course, is not stranger to innovation in the energy space, and many of you work for utilities, local governments, or startups that have conducted or are conducting innovation, or you may also be regulators or policymakers, and in that case, you have also to regulate or support innovation. But questions still come up. Are the innovation policies and programs we have are the ones we need to deploy low carbon innovation? And how can we scale up low carbon innovation faster in a more cost effectively way in Canada? What do we mean by innovation, and how innovation sandboxes can fit in all these pictures? All these questions have been guiding this report. A bit more about the methodology of the report. So we conducted a literature review on innovation policy in the energy sector in Canada. And we also reviewed 10 energy innovation programs across Canada. We tried for a diversity of programs from different regions and from different sectors, including gas and biofuels. And we also included federal programs. We completed this review with a series of interviews with nearly a dozen of utilities and provincial and or federal agencies managing energy innovation programs. In addition, we also looked at innovation sandboxes developed in other sectors in Canada. Part of what we wanted to examine was the different programs and policies and how they address the barriers that present themselves at different stages of innovation. For example, if public funding is a key policy tool to address the barriers innovators are facing at the pre-commercial stage, for example, it might not be sufficient to support the deployment stage due to different barriers. And what we're looking at in the Innovation Sandboxes initiative is the deployment phase of an innovation. And the deployment phase is crucial to transform our energy systems. This is when new technologies and solutions are scaling up and being widely adopted. And a lot of technologies and solutions we need are readily available. We just need to figure out how to get them out to the market. And this is where we need to be innovative in terms of thinking about innovation policies and programs. So I will present a few key findings of our report. The first finding, and this is unlikely to be surprising for you, is that most energy programs in Canada look the same. They tend to follow exactly the same design. So first, innovation is defined through a technological lens. And because of their focus on technology, their scope is mostly limited to demonstration projects and pilots, because the aim is to showcase that a new technology is working. The second characteristic is that except for a few programs, the focus is mainly on electricity. And the last characteristic is that energy innovation programs mainly rely on public funding to get done. While public funding and public investments in innovation is important, it is not sufficient. The second finding is that due to the way energy innovation programs are designed, technological innovation is isolated from the broader energy system. Innovations tend to live in a bubble. There is no or little integration between the innovation space on the one hand and the energy space on the other. Some obstacles include the absence of proper business models and rate structures, as well as a disconnection with the regulatory process. What we heard, for example, is that the deployment of technological innovations can be slowed down or blocked by regulatory lag and a lack of alignment. This happens because regulators are not involved in any innovation programs. Indeed, funding often bypasses rate regulation, and by not engaging regulators ahead of time, it makes it harder for regulation to keep up with technological change. And as a result, the innovation becomes a one-off that is hard to replicate and scale up. And many demonstration or pilot projects tend not to go anywhere. This brings us to our third finding. We need to address the valley of death of deployment and to remove the barriers at the system level that are preventing or slowing down the scale-up and adoption of readily available solutions. When we probed deeper into the barriers to get innovation to market, we found out that technology is not the barrier. We have technologies that work or will work soon. To move to deployment, we need to broaden the concept of innovation beyond the technological lens. As we highlight in our reports, the concept of social innovation or systemic innovation can help us rethink our understanding of innovations in the energy sector.
And looking at finding 4, that the fourth finding is that to accelerate the deployment of available solutions and technologies, innovation, policies and programs need to address really 4 areas that we've found. First, there's a need to develop strong collaboration and knowledge sharing mechanisms. Most energy innovation programs lack a sound and well thought out collaborative and knowledge sharing mechanism. Typically, programs focus on technical knowledge and the results are, at best, only shared in industry conferences and publications. Greater efforts also needs to be made to gather and disseminate this information and to promote this information amongst relevant stakeholders. For instance, an evaluation of the Federal Energy Innovation Program, which was formerly known as the Eco Energy Innovation Initiative, noted that there was little to no funding allocated to sharing knowledge. And this is understandable. In a competitive market, no one likes to share information, and players often like to play their cards close to their chest in order to make sure that they can be more successful. Plus, publicly funded innovation programs rarely put strong emphasis on knowledge dissemination. The funding tends to go more into technology as opposed to the knowledge sharing. This does need to change. But it is not all bad, and things are changing. We have noted progress in this area, and there's a few interesting collaboration initiatives in the programs we reviewed. For example, in the ISO's Grid Innovation Fund in Ontario, innovators are encouraged to pair up with suitable partners. And the Atlantic Smart Energy Communities Initiative is starting a collaboration between the energy utilities of 2 provinces, the NB Power and Nova Scotia Power. The second finding that we have is that new entrants and small businesses are often overwhelmed by the energy regulatory system, as well as by the diversity of the alphabet soup of actors, agencies, and programs. I'm sure for those of us who do work in the energy sector all the time, we can remember with horror when we first started working in the energy sector and we had to learn all the different acronyms and what everybody did. And a lot of these new entrants, they don't have the resources or the capacities to pay consultants to help them navigate the energy system. Only a few programs, energy innovation programs, provide a kind of advisory service for innovators to help them understand and navigate the regulation and the regulatory process. Energy innovation programs should better support all energy players to navigate the system and to help them answer their questions and concerns. And third, we did hear that there's a need to create safe real-world trials for experimenting in the energy ecosystem. In the current demonstration program, there's little interest in learning how an innovation can plug into the current economic, policy, and social dimensions of the system. We often hear concerns of death by demo, or what I like to call a pilotitis, where an innovation is stuck in the loop of having more and more demonstration projects and pilots without substantial deployment afterwards. And as an example, and one person we interviewed noted that there are similar smart thermostat pilot projects being done all across Canada, but there's still not a lot of deployment. What we heard is that we need to move beyond the conventional model that allow for testing non-technological innovation within the real world environment. This could include trialing new business models and new rate structures, testing new consumer behaviors and governance or in operational processes. In other words, how a new innovation can plug into the energy system, or how we can change the system to enable the scale up of a technology. As an example, for smart grid projects, current standards, rules, rates, or codes may need to change, and the regulators, of course, need to be involved in that as well. The Atlantic Smart Energy Community is an example of what we mean by real-world trials. New Brunswick Power, Nova Scotia Power, comparing gathering insights from different grid management structures to better understand consumer behaviors and test their rate structures in the hope of improving it later on. And finally, the fourth thing we learned was that current energy innovation programs have limited to no mechanisms to capture the findings and knowledge from projects and programs in order to inform policy and regulatory changes. Using this information, what we have learned from energy innovation is essential if we're going to remove structural barriers in the energy system and start moving towards deployment of new low carbon innovation. Of the 10 innovation programs we reviewed, we only found one that tried to capture findings to inform policy and regulatory changes, which was the Energy Innovation Program, formerly the ECO-EII. Everyone, there's always an energy and innovation somewhere in the acronym. An evaluation of the program has found that the Energy Innovation Program has informed the development of 25 codes and standards. Aïda?
Yeah, thank you for presenting the last finding. And so now we'll look at where do innovation sandboxes fit once we have done this review of the Canadian energy innovation landscape. So if we want to achieve our climate and economic targets, we need both to speed up the pace of and increase the uptake of innovation. However, we need to do so in a way that benefits all energy consumers and in a way also that mitigates risks and unintended consequences to the larger system. Experiences from other countries suggest that well-thought and well-designed innovation sandboxes can solve both of these problems, as presented earlier by Richard, by providing a broader lens through which to consider energy innovation policies. Innovation sandboxes can help rebalance the focus away from funding technology to also support the deployment of innovation. And let's be clear here, it's not about replacing existing programs, but to complement existing programs with innovation sandboxes. Innovation sandboxes can help move us towards deployment by addressing the 4 areas that innovation policies need to consider and that we identified just earlier. First, innovation hubs can provide for collaboration and knowledge exchange. Second, inquiry services can help innovators navigate the regulatory and policy landscape. The regulatory trials can allow for real-world experimentation. And finally, having mechanisms that capture lessons learned from each of these different buckets can then be used to inform future energy policy and regulatory changes, and also anything else in the energy system. So, but how do we do this? How do we implement innovation sandboxes? First, it's important to keep in mind that innovation sandboxes are not new in Canada. So we can learn what has been done in other sectors by using them. Indeed, some jurisdictions have already established or are developing innovation sandboxes in different sectors. Like in other countries, the first sector to have implemented an innovation sandbox in Canada was the Fintech sector. The Ontario Securities Commission, that is the Ontario regulator for the securities and the financial industry, launched what they call the Launchpad Initiative in 2016. And a year later, the Canadian Security Administrators followed what the Ontario regulator did and created a national regulatory trial system for the fintech sector. In addition, following the 2018 federal targeted regulatory reviews, the federal government is considering or is currently developing innovation sandboxes in the transportation, the health, and the agri-food sectors. And some budget has been even committed to these initiatives. So by looking at what has been done already, we can learn how territorial and provincial governments on the one hand, and the federal government on the other hand, can align and collaborate in the design and implementation of innovation sandboxes in the energy sector. Some municipalities are also adopting innovation sandboxes, such as in Montreal. This suggests that local governments have also a role to play in innovation sandboxes in the energy sector, especially as they are increasingly involved in energy transition. Innovation sandboxes are not foreign to the Canadian energy sector neither. The Ontario Energy Board introduced an innovation sandbox in 2019. So the Ontario Energy Board provides for regulatory trials where derogations from the OEB codes, rules, licensing requirements, and some statutory provisions can be made. So they just focus on the regulatory trials. They do not have like the other buckets of innovation sandboxes. And preliminary results of the OEB's initiative suggests that the innovation sandbox design can be improved to enhance coordination with other regulatory bodies and to incorporate additional tools beyond the regulatory trial approach. For example, the OEB notes that information and guidance on regulatory issues were what most of the proponents wanted, rather than just using regulatory trials. In addition to the OEB Innovation Sandbox, several energy innovation programs in Canada have incorporated one or more innovation sandbox-like tools in their design. So it's not really like always like regulatory trial, but it can be like just trial for trialing like a new rates, for example. And so this innovation sandbox-like tool can also like inform how an innovation sandbox in the energy sectors can be implemented. And if you want to have more information about those, you can just look at page 29 of our report. So now we need to be more intentional in developing and implementing innovation sandboxes. To really gain the benefits of innovation sandboxes, we need to design them properly. There is not only one way to design a sandbox, because there is no one type of innovation sandbox. Innovation sandbox need to be tailored to the local context and the specific needs of the jurisdiction in which they are developed. This is why the design phase is crucial. If we want to develop effective energy innovation sandboxes in Canada, we need to make sure that they reflect each jurisdiction's contexts and needs. And this requires to incorporate the feedback from diverse stakeholders representing the entire energy system, not just the regulator or the utilities. We also need the perspective from energy users, local governments, and new entrants, and so on. Therefore, developing effective innovation sandboxes requires the use of innovative and inclusive engagement processes. And you can read more about that in our first report. And now I will let Richard provide an overview of the next steps of our project.
Thank you very much, Aïda. Thank you for that quick overview. Now we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, this report is this is the beginning of our 4-year project looking at how Canada can benefit from innovation sandboxes and how we can increase the deployment of low carbon innovation across Canada using innovation sandboxes. This is the second report, and you can read both of our reports on our website, and the links are provided here. The next step that you're going to be probably hearing from us is that we're going to be holding a national workshop on the barriers to innovation in the energy sector in Canada. We are planning on holding this workshop in Q2 of 2021 this year, so the next couple of months. And given that this is still March 2020, I guess, I'm not sure when we are anymore. Time doesn't have no meaning. It will still be, will likely be virtual, and we'll probably be reaching out for many of you to participate. And just to give you an idea of how we're planning it, we're now in phase 2 of our program. The national workshop is really the start of the phase 2 of the program, which is looking at how do we implement innovation sandboxes. And starting from the national workshop, we're going to be looking into more details about how we can start developing the frameworks for innovation sandboxes in Canadian jurisdictions. And due to COVID, like everybody else, we've had to move things around. And so activities may change further depending on further COVID restrictions or additional funding. But our plan is following on from the national workshop later on the early part of first half of this year. We're then going to be working with up to 8 jurisdictions across Canada in order to collaboratively develop policy frameworks for innovation sandboxes that meet the specific needs of those jurisdictions. And we're going to be doing this by holding collaborative workshops with all stakeholders in order to look at what are the objectives for that jurisdiction, what are the particular barriers for that jurisdiction, and the solutions and the different criteria. So we'll be collaboratively developing the innovation sandboxes with these different jurisdictions. And that is we want to hear your questions. I see some questions have already come through on the Zoom link. So how long? 31 minutes. That's actually just as we had planned. So I am very impressed. And so if we have any questions, we can talk about them now. Emily, have you been?
Yeah.
Can you tell me some of the questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Richard and Aïda. So we have 5 questions so far. If anybody has any more, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A. So first question, what did you learn about the traditional regulatory, I believe, total resource cost test?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, that is used, that does not allow for the innovation being funded by the rate base.
Well, I think we have seen that the traditional regulatory total resource cost test, it does tend to focus on replacing like with like, and tends to focus on solutions that have already been used in the past. It has benefits in terms of being able to assess what solutions have been used in the past and how to do it. But if you're starting to look at different solutions and different ways of doing things, and also allowing these solutions to be tried, there are some barriers. I would also argue that by using the total resource cost test, it puts it goes through the regular regulatory system, which can lead to a lot of delays in programs because of difficulty in assessing new innovation within the current regulatory framework. So by using an innovation sandbox, you can kind of test an innovation in a controlled manner in, say, a small area in the real world. So in an easier way, so you can see how that could then fit into the regular regulatory system. And then with the idea would be that if the sandbox is successful and they can demonstrate benefits, that the innovation then can be used as a regular input into the standard regulatory proceedings.
Great, thank you, Richard. Next question, is there a role for a Canada-wide regulator or CAMPUT to address information sharing gaps across provinces? If yes, is there any funding available for this, to your knowledge?
I think CAMPUT does a great job of sharing information across provinces. I think it's very valuable. I'm not sure what kind of funding is available. To be honest, I'm not even sure how CAMPUT is funded. But I'm guessing that there's unlikely to be funding for this information sharing, and probably it would be, I think it should be expanded to just beyond regulators. They obviously need to include them, which may have more of a role for the federal government to do that.
And maybe I would jump here, like I did a not great manipulation on the question and answer box, and I answered the question that we haven't answered. asked by Jennifer Hiscock. So sorry about that, Jennifer. The question was, finding two isn't across the board, and finding two, it's I think the fact that what is finding two? I need to go back. So that finding two is not across the board. We've seen rates used for project participation in a few projects now. And I would say, like, my answer to this would be, yeah, that's true. Like, there is more and more projects that are testing new rate structure. But what we've seen is, like, often the regulators is not part of the equation. And so those rate structure, it could be great to involve the regulators. So there is also learning mechanisms here to report back and see how we can change this in a more longer term in a way that still protect the consumers and do not jeopardize the utility models, or like or do not jeopardize the entire system. So it's really about, like, how do you use after, like, who is involved in developing those rate structure projects, and how do you use the learning or the lessons from it, so you can inform in a longer term how to change or adapt the rate structures.
Thank you, Aïda. Next question. What interest have you seen from different provinces and regulators in being a part of next steps and potentially creating new sandboxes?
I think we've seen quite good interest from, it's still, of course, every time you start dealing with the regulator and the government and energy policymakers across Canada, it's always slower than anyone wants it to be. So we're in discussion with a number of jurisdictions, and we hope to have some. But there's a lot of interest we're finding. It's just trying to put everything together, trying to get all the stakeholders together is taking longer. It's taking a long time.
Okay, next question. It's kind of a two-part question. Do we have a sandbox for smart building technologies and programs that, one, has both energy benefits that are easy to measure the savings, and then two, but are also have productivity benefits that are related to income and earnings and even comfort and benefits?
David, that's a very good question. I'm not sure exactly how we would go about doing that. That's something we'd have to sit down and really talk about. And I think that's part of what our framework is really about. We really have not gone into next step is kind of how do we design these things? What are the barriers? What kind of systems do we need to kind of create that? But I think just off the top of my head is we need to identify what are the barriers to that? What are the regulations? What are the policies that are standing in the way? Who has ownership of those policies? And then how can we create a trial process that could fit within that system?
Thank you, Richard. Next, a few years ago, the IESO convened the Data Strategy Advisory Council to unlock smart meter data for municipalities, universities, and consultants. The recommendations had support of all parties, but the OEB refused to allow it to be implemented. Do you think the Innovation Sandbox might present a less threatening way to present this idea to the OEB?
Alex, someone has to bring up energy data every single time you have an energy webinar in Canada. It is the constant refrain. That's a good idea, actually, Alex, and something that's something we should definitely discuss. I think this is going to be unlocking smart meter data in a way that allows people to access the data while protecting their privacy is necessary for a lot of the changes we're going to be looking at in Ontario, at least. Other provinces do it slightly differently, and I think that's something that how do we unlock data? I think could be an interesting kind of part of an innovation sandbox. Aïda?
Yeah, no, I have nothing to add, except that maybe I don't know. I wasn't really. I don't have a lot of knowledge on this initiative, but I think part of the issue, or maybe not an issue, but if you design an innovation sandboxes, then maybe the regulator can be part of this conversation early on. So maybe like having this conversation again by starting having the regulator part of this working at this advisory council would have been maybe helpful. And this is at least like what we're trying to do with innovation sandboxes, but maybe it was, I'm not aware of this, but yeah, I think there is potential here for sure.
Thank you. I have a comment in the Q&A asking to list the first report. I'm just sending that into the chat now, the English version, as well as the French version for those that are interested. Okay, and next question. Given that you say innovation sandboxes must be tailored to their jurisdictions, I wonder what your stance is on nationwide innovation sandboxes. Would these be as effective as innovation sandboxes deployed at the provincial territorial level? And could you speak on the pros and cons of each?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I will say like it's not in matter of binary, should it be like federal or provincial? I think that both levels of governments have a role to play. So we know that it's mostly like provinces that have a lot of competencies or responsibilities over the energy system. This is the province that are regulating them. So it's important that there is like engagement at the provincial level for each of them. But what we've seen, if you look at what's happened in other sectors, or like what we've seen in kind of innovative programs and policy put in place, is that usually I will say like you have to look at the component of the sandbox that we showed earlier. So what we've seen as an emerging trend, I will say, is like, for example, the regulatory trial of it will be mainly hosted within the provincial level, because the regulators in the energy systems are located here. But maybe like that, and the same for the service inquiry. For example, like if you want to help innovators or players navigating the system, then maybe it should also like be more located at the provincial level. However, like if you look at collaboration, then maybe the federal level may be also a good entry point to develop this, and information about like gathering, harvesting information and learnings from different projects can also be done at both levels, so we can inform after policy changes. So I would say is like just to find like, and there can also be the role for the federal governments to help, you know, in having jurisdictions share their mechanisms and how they are developing regulatory trials or services inquiries to try to streamline some of the practices or this kind of thing. So there might be a role also here. So I will say it's not like having either or, but like for sure, provinces can have the lead, and there is also a role for the national government, for the federal government.
Thank you, Aïda. Next question. Does the regulatory trial currently collaborate with other countries and nations outside of Canada, such as Alaska, Norway, and China?
Okay.
Not that I know of. Generally, there's very little cross. I know there's some, not so much collaboration, but some information sharing from where they use examples from other jurisdictions, but it's collaboration I've not really seen a lot. We're valuing it anyways. Although there's a lot of times collaboration between the different between the players on it as well.
Okay, next question. You suggest that sandboxes should be tailored to regional and local contexts. How can the concept be best applied to complex sectors like bioenergy, where I'm sorry, I just lost the question. Oh, there we go. Where its production relies on complex supply chains, such as different biomass feedstocks sourced from different regions and transported and processed differently.
It's a very good question.
Yeah. And again, it's go back to the idea that it's not about like having only one type of sandboxes. Like it's what is interesting with the concept of innovation sandboxes is that it's flexible tools. So you can take whatever makes sense for the energy sector you're looking at. So again, like if I build on what I was explaining earlier, answering the previous questions about federal versus provincial, and explaining that both need to be involved. So maybe it makes sense, for example, if you look at the natural gas sector or the power sector, like indeed the provincial level is very important, but maybe in that here in the bioenergy, and this is not my background, so I'm speaking here like in theory, it might be more relevant to have a sandbox-like initiative at the federal level and to coordinate the key actors in this sector, and maybe like to see like how it makes sense for the province and the federal governments to collaborate. And I know like it's always like a specific question, or sorry, it's very specific question, but not specific answers, because again, it's you cannot be prescriptive in innovation sandboxes. It's really bringing all the different stakeholders, and when I say all, it's really all the relevant one. You cannot just build the stakeholders with just a few sandboxes, just with a few stakeholders of energy sector to really like articulate what makes sense. So what are the barriers you are having? What could be potential solutions, and how do we work together to develop those specific like innovation sandboxes, either through regulatory trials or more collaboration and so on.
Thank you, Aïda. Next question, how do inter-provincial regulators communicate or work together to optimize new or existing technology with respect to energy efficiency and energy transfer across the meter or across the property line?
I'm not sure. There'd be some collaboration through CANPUT and also informal collaboration as regulators do talk to each other. I don't know of any formal process for that, apart from, of course, the technical kind of standardization that would come through CSAs and whatnot. But I don't know of any. Kind of official collaboration with regulators to kind of work on specific issues. And I think each of these rules, I know, because they're different also in different jurisdictions.
Maybe I just want to point out to one of Jennifer Hiscock answers here, just pointing out that there is an international knowledge sharing elements under your innovation hubs. So yeah, that's
yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, that would be, yes, yeah, that'd be, yeah, the idea would be as well during the innovation hubs, of course, the collaboration would be, we'd be able to learn from everybody, and the knowledge sharing would include everyone that could be included in that, including the international experience, because there's a lot we can share with and learn from and help the other jurisdictions and other countries learn from what we've done as well.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions, and we have about 10 more minutes for the webinar. So if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to add them into the Q&A. I'll move on to the next one. How do innovation sandboxes differ from strategic niche management, which is a policy tool that's been used increasingly in several European Union countries to test innovations in technology, business models, and regulatory structures in protected spaces?
I think it's hard for me to answer like strategic niche management per se. My understanding of this strategic niche management, it's like more an approach that policymakers have to try to diffuse or scale up some specific innovations. So I guess I will see like it's hard. There might be like some overlap here. I will say that Innovation Sandboxes, again, is not only a policy tool. My understanding of strategic niche management is like really policymakers doing that. I will say like Innovation Sandboxes will be a bit more broader in the stakeholders they are engaging. It's also about regulators and utilities, and you do not pick a technology per se, but you just like provide the conditions to have a set of technologies or to achieve an outcome and to be able like to change a bit the system that way.
That's a good answer, Aïda, and I agree. I think from my understanding, strategic niche management, I'm not an expert on it, but it is, as you're saying, a policy-making solutions. I think sandboxes could be a part of strategic niche management because it could be kind of the experimentation part of it, because it could be an element of the SNM. And I think that could probably be borne out by that the EU, a lot of the countries in the EU, pretty much all of them now, or most of them, are looking into developing innovation sandboxes. And the EU is, as an organization, is also looking into developing an EU-wide sandbox framework as well. Still under discussion, but they are looking into doing something.
Great, thank you. And I have another comment from Jennifer. There's international knowledge sharing. Elements under the innovation hubs are supported internationally through the IEA and Mission Innovation. Thank you, Jennifer. Next question. Even if sandboxes provide insight and answers, how do we get recalcitrant regimes to pay attention and move forward?
I will say, like, usually it's we don't have an answer, and I'm not sure. I hope you were not expecting an answer or solutions from me. But where I see like the sandbox entering into the equation, it's usually like again with these inquiry services. Often what we realize with our first reports is like we speak of regulatory barriers, but usually those barriers are just perceived. And so there is really, you can change the regime by making sure that new actors and new players entering this regime are also understanding the regime they're working in. So having more accessible regulatory process, more accessible understanding of the regulation can also be very helpful. And this doesn't need like to really like change a lot of things. So you can already do a lot with the existing system, but just better information sharing about how the system is working by targeting those new entrants. So sometimes it's not about like changing everything. It's just about like again bringing together different actors and see. I feel like my opinion is that sometimes there is people who are recalcitrant just because there might be like misunderstanding or misalignment, and it's about like how do you bring together all those people in the room.
Yeah, I think it's also, I think one element that we found in our first report was that leadership is important, and that you need someone kind of either politically through the government or the regulator or different organizations are available, has to somewhat push this. So to a certain extent, as trying to get a recalcitrant regime to pay attention and move forward there's not a lot you can do other than vote for people who might push them more or provide leadership. That might be one option. The second would be by having demonstrated success elsewhere. So if other jurisdictions have innovation sandboxes and can demonstrate success, it can demonstrate that there are benefits to this innovation, then it's possible that you might be able to convince the recalcitrant regime to move forward. But it would be difficult to push them too much, because what you find is without strong leadership pushing it, it can be difficult to make a lot of movement on this. And I think we've been seeing that, and if you compare different provinces across Canada, I think we can see that happening in Canada as an example.
Okay, we have 2 more questions and 5 more minutes. NARUC regulators have members across all states and provinces and are sharing the reports they produce on smart grid and transactive energy. GWAC in the PNNL and SCPA are working on many of the electrical innovation issues. Sorry, more of a comment there.
Yeah, that's, I mean, what you're saying, I would agree with a lot of that, because these are US organizations. And with NERIC and SEPA, you're really seeing, and also you're looking at NREL as well, that there's a lot more capacity in the US for information sharing and a lot more mechanisms for that. There are very few mechanisms federally in Canada for information sharing on a lot of these issues. NRCan is starting to do that and is stepping up. But in comparison to the different actors and the strength of the different actors in the US, there's not quite as much. But even then, there still is examples of where information sharing could probably be better on particular issues as well, even with the structures they do have.
Okay, and last question. Are there case studies that identify which innovation sandboxes have been successful? And is there an understanding why?
Read our first report.
Yeah.
There's not a huge history of sandboxes, so there's not a lot of in-depth analysis, but our first report has a lot of the information looking at how to best design a sandbox and what lessons have been learned from international experience. And I believe, Emily, you can probably confirm that the webinar for the first report is available online as well, if you don't want to read the report, even though I believe Aïda and I wrote a great report.
Yes, the first webinar recording is actually available on Quest's YouTube page, and I can send that link into the chat now.
I guess I could move forward, and as we look, so what can you do next? So as we are thinking about as we think about what, thanks for all your questions. Thank you for coming and attending our webinar. Really appreciate it. And so now what can we do now? We're still finalizing, as you mentioned, the list of jurisdictions that will be participating in the next stage. And if you are a regulator or policymaker from a Canadian jurisdiction, and you are interested in participating in this Innovation Sandbox projects, please do let us know. We would be happy to talk to you more about that and to think how we can help you out, or where we can work together. We have a brief survey on the webinar, which there's a link there, and I believe the link will be sent out afterwards as well, along with the recording of the webinar as well. So we'd really appreciate if you know what you think. I know everyone asked you to do a brief survey, but we've tried to keep it short, but it is very valuable for us. And it does provide us with a lot of information. It's very important as we consider what we're going to do next, and in making sure that we are meeting the information that we're hoping to get across, and to make sure that we are successful in doing that. So we'd really appreciate if you can complete the survey. And finally, if you want to contact us, here are our details. Aïda and I are always available. We're literally not going anywhere. So please contact us if you have any additional comments or questions, or you work for a jurisdiction that would be potentially a participant. Aïda, anything you want to say?
No, just need to update the email address here. I will change
Oh, it's the wrong email address. Oh, that's embarrassing. I didn't even look at that one.
My fault. I was sure to make sure to send the corrected version of the slide.
Yes, sorry about that. That's not Aïda's email address, but we'll make sure we correct that in the follow-up information. Sorry about that, Aïda.
Thank you, everyone, for attending, and looking forward to continuing the conversation. Bye.
All right.